Today, we're going to be looking at America as a world power. So, we're going to be focusing on foreign policies that three different presidents used to exert American influence over the world. So, this is Unit 3, Notes number 4. Theodore Roosevelt and the World. In 1901, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States when President William McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt was unwilling to allow the imperial powers of Europe to control the world's political and economic destiny. By the time that TR, its nickname for Theodore Roosevelt, became president, it was felt that the U.S. needed a canal to cut across Central America. Such a canal would reduce travel time for commercial and military ships by providing shortcuts between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So, in these notes, we'll be talking about Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, three presidents that we had talked about previously during the Progressive Era. So, in those notes, we focused on their domestic policies, kind of how they handled things within the US. Here, in these notes, we'll be focusing on their foreign policies and how they deal with other countries. So, the Panama Canal. So, before we talk about the Panama Canal, so we're talking about traveling via boat. So if a ship was leaving from New York, it'd have to go all the way around South America, come back up to San Francisco. That's a long journey, approximately 13,000 miles. And again, vice versa if you're traveling from San Francisco going to New York. So now that we have a strong Navy, we want to be able to manage both sides of our country and send ships back and forth as quickly as possible. So we want to try to find a shortcut, a faster route. And so to do that, a canal would have to be made somewhere here in Central America. And by making a canal, you are cutting through the land since no natural canal exists. So there'll be lots of obstacles that have to be overcome for this to be accomplished. So, engineered identified two possible routes for the proposed canal, one through Nicaragua and the other through Panama. In 1903, the U.S. decided to use the Panama route and bought it from the French for $40 million. So, the French had already been trying to create this canal. They didn't have a lot of luck. This is a very difficult process, and once we'll talk about the construction of canal and the kind of difficulties that go into it. However, before beginning work on the Panama Canal, the U.S. had to get permission from Colombia, which then ruled Panama. So we needed access to the land to make this canal. The land belongs to another country. So the native people in the canal zone that we wanted access to were Panamanian, but the Colombian government oversaw that land and they did not want it to give us access. So there was our first dilemma. So constructing the canal. When negotiations with Colombia broke down, the U.S. helped to organize a Panamanian rebellion against Colombia. So if the Panamanians were independent, they would give the U.S. access. So we assisted them in helping to gain their independence. In 1903, Panama and the U.S. signed a treaty where the U.S. agreed to pay Panama $10 million plus an annual rent of $250,000 for the canal zone. Construction of the Panama Canal was one of the world's greatest engineering feats. Builders fought disease such as yellow fever and malaria because of the tropical environment. It was very difficult for them to continue work because they kept on getting sick. And these are also the types of illnesses that you could get repeatedly. And the soft volcanic soil proved difficult to remove. They could be working and digging, and all of a sudden it could collapse and refill again. So it made it hard to make progress. Work on the canal began in 1904 with the clearing of brush and the draining of swamps. By 1913, the height of construction, more than 43,400 workers were employed. And in the process, more than 5,600 workers died from either accidents or disease. On August 15th, 1914, the canal was open for business. So it took 10 years for this canal to be constructed. So it was a very long process. The US and Latin American relations, however, had been damaged by the American support of the rebellion in Panama. Some of the other countries didn't necessarily like that the US got involved and the way in which we kind of were able to get access to the canal. So the Panama Canal. Here we have a picture of the workers. Very tough, labor-intensive work. And then we have pictures of the actual canal and how that works. So you have one side, the Atlantic Ocean. There was another lake that the ships would travel through, and then it would go to the Pacific Ocean. And in the process, there would be a series of locks that the ships would enter. And so this gives you a diagram showing you how the locks work, where a ship would enter into the lock, they would close, water would rise to kind of either raise them to come up or raise them to come down. So this picture here is what the actual locks look like. And so ships have to be a certain size in order to fit through the locks. Now, there are certain ships that are too large to fit through the locks, whether they're cruise ships or military ships or just like freight ships that are containing stuff. So they have to be of a certain size to fit through the locks today. But the Panama Canal still runs, still works. I believe it was 1999 that the US gave full access of the canal back to Panama. So the US had controlled the canal until 1999, and now Panama controls the canal. So let's stop and think. What is the significance about the building of the Panama Canal? Well, first, it gives the U.S. total dominance over both Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, which is for military purposes, makes us able to maneuver ships from the East Coast to the West Coast, helps to support that military goal of dominance within the Western Hemisphere. It also shows kind of the persistenceness of the U.S. to get things accomplished. The engineering feat we're able to accomplish. And so it just kind of helps to put more, elevate the status of the US. The Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt was determined to make the US the predominant power in the Caribbean and Central America. He reminded European powers of the Monroe Doctrine, which had been issued in 1823 by President James Monroe. The Monroe Doctrine demanded that European countries stay out of affairs of Latin America. The Roosevelt Corollary. Roosevelt based his Latin American policy on a West African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. In his December 1904 message to Congress, Roosevelt added the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The corollary said that the U.S. would now use force to protect its economic interest in Latin America. So what the Roosevelt Corollary is, it's basically an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. So in 1823, President James Monroe is giving kind of a warning to European powers to stay out of Latin America. Just a warning. Now, with the Roosevelt Corollary, President Roosevelt is saying, yes, stay out of here. And if you don't, this is the added part, this is the corollary, we will use our force, military force, against you. So now we're adding that added threat there, in case countries aren't quite still understanding what the intention of the Monroe Doctrine is. So here are a few political cartoons to kind of illustrate this concept of big stick diplomacy. So you see Roosevelt here, this larger than life persona with this club, this bat, this big stick. And so the idea behind this proverb is you speak softly, but when you're carrying a weapon, it's something that you are intimidating someone else with. And so what our weapon is, the big stick of the United States, it was our Navy. We have this strong, powerful Navy. We've just demonstrated how strong it is through the Spanish-American War. And so we're letting other countries know that if you plan to come into Latin America, our part of the world, Western Hemisphere, we will have no problems using our military, our Navy against you. Dollar diplomacy. So next president is William Howard Taft. And if you remember back from before, Taft's personality is different from Roosevelt. He's not boisterous and out there. So his foreign policy isn't going to be so in your face like Taft's. I'm sorry, like Roosevelt's is. So William Howard Taft's administration followed the policy of using U.S. government to guarantee loans made to foreign countries by American business people. This policy was called dollar diplomacy. So instead of using our military might, we're going to use our economic strength. It was often used to keep European powers out of the Caribbean. So, dollar diplomacy in action. And so, basically, what it is we don't want Latin American countries to be in debt to European countries. So, we help them pay off their debts to European countries, but in exchange, now they're indebted to us. So during the 1910s, the US exercised its police power on several occasions. In 1911, President Taft arranged for US banks to loan money to Nicaragua to pay off its debts. In return, US bankers gained control of Nicaragua's state owned railroad system and national bank. So they're basically trading, kind of being indebted to a European power that was further away. Now they're indebted to the US, and it allows for the US to have greater influence over what their country is doing. And so that's how we're able to kind of exert this overseeing influence into Latin America. So let's stop and think. How did dollar diplomacy compare to the Roosevelt corollary? So within both instances, we are exerting our presence, our influence over other countries. They definitely reflect the personalities of the presidents, with the Roosevelt corollary being kind of more bold and in your face with the threat of military intervention. Whereas dollar diplomacy, we're using our economic might to pay off debts, but still placing that emphasis on kind of who's in charge, who you are now indebted to. So just showing you different ways of how foreign policies were used by these two presidents. Woodrow Wilson's missionary diplomacy. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson gave the Monroe Doctrine a moral tone. According to Wilson's missionary diplomacy, the U.S. had a moral responsibility to deny recognition to any Latin American government it viewed as oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to U.S. interests. So if we felt that the government maybe had a dictator, totalitarian leader, we were not going to recognize them. We're trying to show that we want countries to be democratic and fair and treat their people fair. Prior to this, the US recognized any government that controlled a nation regardless of their policies. Wilson's policy pressured nations in the Western Hemisphere to establish democratic governments. The Mexican Revolution would put Wilson to the test. The Mexican Revolution. In 1911, Mexican revolutionaries overthrew the government and executed leaders. Because of the brutality of the revolution, the U.S. did not support the new government. Rebel leaders like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata drew Mexico close to war with the United States. Through missionary diplomacy, the U.S. showed that it would use force and influence to change oppressive governments. Foreign policy goals. U.S. intervention in Mexican affairs provided a clear model for imperialist attitudes. Americans believed in the superiority of free enterprise democracy. So we're starting to see that, while what we think is the best way, democracy, free enterprise, capitalism, we're trying to push those values onto other countries. Several goals were pursued with these foreign policies. It expanded U.S. access to foreign markets to ensure growth in the domestic economy. The U.S. built a modern navy to protect its interests abroad, and the U.S. exercised its international police power to ensure dominance in Latin America. So let's stop and think. What was the intention of Wilson's moral diplomacy? And so he wants to ensure, and I think has like the best intentions, very idealistic, of countries treating their people fairly. He didn't want to support countries that had authoritarian rule, totalitarian rule, that allowed for revolutions to happen that executed their leaders. So the idea was, we need to ensure that these people don't know how to govern themselves. They need us to go in and tell them what to do. So while it may have started with the best intentions, it kind of gets a little presumptuous towards the end of we know better than you what we're doing. But again, ultimately, the idea was we want to protect the people that the governments are ruling over to ensure that they all have access to basic human rights, freedom, democracy. So these are the end of our notes. Make sure you go back to do your key terms.